So, next is elitism. The members of the group are the chosen people, exalted, righteous. Members are made to feel special when compared to outsiders. There's this sense of eliteness. What do you think?
I don't know how much that sort of falls under that. I do know that the way that the community, people in the community act is very entitled, but I don't think they necessarily see themselves as elite or entitled. I think they view themselves as oppressed and marginalized and like people who are just trying to secure human rights. So I don't think they don't see themselves as chosen or elite or anything from what I can think
Hmm.
of.
Yeah. It's interesting. If you make a study of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, for example, then there's like this difference between the society that they were criticizing and trying to change and the new society. And so they framed all of the landlords and the capitalists who were the elites of the old society as bad. But then all of the people who were the workers or whose parents were in the army or were aligned with the ideology, they were marginalized in the old society, but they were given privilege in the new society and in their own domain. And so it depends on where you zoom in. If you zoom in only on the wider world, then you could say at one point that trans people were marginalized. But if you zoom into the community itself, then we've talked about before how there's a hierarchy of dominance that is determined by your oppression identity markers. And so your voice is given a stronger weight. You're shielded from criticism and you're given financial privilege when asking for donations based on your oppression markers within that realm. And so I guess there's that element of it where it's hard to say precisely. The second thing is the sense of righteousness. I think anytime you have any of these systems, there's always a moral dimension to it. And if you believe that you're on the right side of history, or that you are following God's commands, or that you have the right political philosophy, then that sense of righteousness infuses everything you do, but it also infuses your sense of identity. You are a good person. And by extension, you're better than people who don't think or believe the way that you do. And then that fuels the actions that you take. And it may lead you to feel justified in doing something against other people because they are ontologically evil. And so you can do anything to them in the service of a higher cause. But all of these things speak to this notion that the people who are in the in group are somehow better than or more morally justified than everybody else. And it informs all of those decisions.
So that sounds more familiar, especially like the idea of being on the right side of history and like having the moral high ground. There's definitely a strong sense of that.
How effective is that at keeping the group together or keeping people in the group? Did you feel like you were going to lose that sense of goodness if you ever considered leaving the group, or did it play a role?
Maybe a little bit. When I detransitioned, it wasn't like I had lost like my morals or my righteousness at all, but that was something that came up more as my opinions about things were changing.
When
So
you
I
say you didn't lose your morals or your righteousness, how did you define those things at that time when you were detransitioning?
I wanted to see myself as like empathetic and compassionate. And
Mm.
as I was right at the beginning of detransition, there was like a part of me that wanted to. We see this a lot when I'm seeing detrans people online. There's this idea of being like a good detransitioner and a bad detransitioner. And I don't think anyone necessarily calls themselves that, although those of us who are the bad ones might just call us that as just a bit of irony. But the quote unquote good ones are calling themselves trans positive. So they're people
Mm-hmm.
who still believe in the ideology, basically. And there's also another contingent of us who wants detransition and being a detransitioner to be defined by having left the ideology. So these people who think that they're the good detransitioners who are quote unquote trans positive are basically people who have decided this pathway is not for me, but the ideology is still correct and everybody who believes in it is still righteous and etc. I'm not sure how to sort of translate that to a religious cult or anything
Oh
like
no,
that. Like,
absolutely. There's definitely a way to
yeah,
do that. So there's something called PMO, which is physically in, mentally out. But then there's also a correlate to that, which is where you're mentally in but physically out. There may be people who have decided they just can't live up to the standards of the group, but they still believe in the truth of the group. So they may either remove themselves from the group or be cast out, but they still believe in the tenets of the group. The group is good and right. They just can't live up to it themselves.
mhm,
And so there's no incentive to, and there's a disincentive for them to really investigate the claims of the group because they're still heavily influenced by and identify with the group. And so they may not really move on in their life or start to develop an identity separate from the group. So that's definitely something that does exist. And those people are then vulnerable to be brought back into the good graces of the group and come back into the group itself. And there's a few stories of people having a season of that in their life that you'll find if you watch various different cult documentaries. So I can definitely see that playing a role in it. When you talked about the good detransitioners and the bad transitioners, it reminded me of a phenomenon that happens in the ex-Mormon world where people who leave the church but then start talking about the things that they found wrong with the church. They start spreading information that points to the false claims of the leader of the church or the abuses of power that have historically or presently exist in the church. They're the wrong kind of apostates. And so the thing that gets told them is that you left the church, but you can't leave the church alone. You need to move on with your life and silence your criticisms and just only build up what you want to be. Stop trying to be an activist because all of those people are the wrong types of ex-Mormons. But that's the people in the faith labeling those outside of the faith that. I think there's more of a sense among ex-Mormons that if you want to just leave and get on with your life and not say another peep about it, more power to you. But if you're doing that and then you're criticizing those people who do speak out about it, then they may have something more to say. But you get the freedom to either make it something that's part of your journey after Mormonism or not. I mean, it sounds like there may be some parallels there, particularly with people who remain in or the good type of detransitioner.
right, yeah, that does. It sounds pretty much the exact same. And yeah, the good ones, I don't know if they even count as detransitioners, just because the way that everything is defined, it's so incoherent. So there are people who say that they've detransitioned, and what they mean is they stopped taking hormones,
Yeah.
but they still identify as trans and are living an opposite sex role every day of their life. And to me, that is not a detransitioner. If you stopped hormones, then you're just a trans person that stopped hormones. So to
Mm.
me, that it doesn't even make sense. It feels like they're trying to co-opt detransition so that they can say that it's not as bad as the rest of us are saying it is.
It strikes me one of the things that we look for in trying to soften the divide between the insiders and the outsider in the religious realm is having landing zones that are safe, is the metaphor, where people may not be ready for the jump straight from the most radical to complete abandonment of the ideology. That's a harder ask than people who are willing at least to move further away from a radical position into something that is a little bit softer for them on their own journey. That may be a point at which it's easier then to take the next step to completely disentangle themselves from it. And I think we're seeing in the religious realm, a lot of people have found benefit to having that space where they can do that, where it was no longer an all or nothing type of thing, and that it may have been harder for them to go cold turkey. But I don't know if that type of phenomenon exists in the domain that you're talking about.
It sounds a little bit like there people have referred to non-binary identities as both like an on-ramp and an off-ramp, and it was for me. So like I identified as a man for 6 years, and then when I went off of testosterone, I identified as non-binary. And I think that is my version of being in between, and
Okay.
sort of it was disengaging from it because I was moving away from medicalization, but not at the same time. But I think there are a lot of people who say they've detransitioned but identify as non-binary. So they're still like 1 foot in, but I do think
Yeah.
that is a way of softening it, especially because for a lot of people it's difficult to go from being referred to as like a man and as with he him pronouns and then for it to switch overnight all the way back to being referred to as a woman and being referred to as she, her pronouns, I think there's some psychological barriers that a lot of people have to deal with when they're making that transition and then referring to themselves as non-binary so that they don't have to necessarily commit to either, I think is a good sort of in-between stage for them. So I try not to be too critical of them, but yeah.
All right. So on this question of elitism, there was one other dimension you mentioned earlier on, which is that people who had gone further along the medicalization route tended to have a higher status within the community itself. What do you think? Does that carry its own form of elitism within the group?
I think a little bit, yes. And even as I mentioned myself, I felt like I was more trans than my non-binary friend that had no intention of medicalizing. I don't think most people in the trans community would say that people who have medicalized are seen as better or anything, but you couldn't deny that they seem more committed. For sure. It's irreversible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about
They
that
might,
sense of
yeah.
specialness that they're referring to here? Is there a sense of specialness that I know that critics of the young generation that have accepted and identify with this ideology called them snowflakes? And they're making fun of this idea that every one of them is special and their specialness is somehow tied to their identity and gives them their entitlement. And of course, the older generation is against that. Is what degree does specialness play?
When I think of that, I think about how most people that identify as trans, they separate themselves from everyone else by this whole idea of you will never understand what I'm going through. And I think that's also a very identitarian thing where, me as a white person will never understand what a black person goes through. And I think that sort of same feeling of you will, like a cis person could never understand what a trans person goes through. I think there is a feeling of specialness that comes with that for sure. So it is definitely, and it's one of the things that keeps people in the group is that understanding that we all understand each other and we know how to treat each other, and the people outside of the group, they don't know how to treat us because they're not us, then they will never understand what it's like to be us, and therefore within the group you're safe but outside of it you're not thing. So yeah, there is a sense of that, I think.
That could also serve to shield you from criticism or questioning, and a shield of doubt in terms of if somebody brings up a counter argument to something, then you just say, well, you just don't understand. You haven't lived my experience. And so it's a way of shutting down internal doubt. But we'll get to that when we get to the thought terminating cliches.
Yes.
So what do you think? Elitism, how strong a factor is this in your existence in the trans community?
Trans people are sacred. We are the divine. We're practicing our divinity by expressing authenticity, by enjoying our multiplicity, elevating our humanity, finding the unity hidden inside community, remembering our collective connectivity fuels courageous creativity, unlocking the blessed spirituality that we all seek. Yeah, this shit's about to get spiritual. Because the truth is, queerness is magic, like pure magic. I mean, we are beautiful and powerful, and for that, we are killed. I mean, the violence is real. We all know how my story ends. But yeah, thank you for letting me grab this beginning moment here with you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for kindness, for giving me courage. I am Joan. This is my story. This is my truth.
It was funny because I started out being like, I'm not sure, but now I think it was intense.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
I think a lot of this exercise is just stepping back and seeing how it plays out in religious or political contexts that are removed from your own experience, because then it helps you understand a little bit better if it did show up in your experience. And that's what I'm hoping that this test does for people from many different backgrounds.